Today it is politically correct to try and level the sexes and say that we're equal. And there's nothing wrong with that. But equal does not mean the same. And I think that's the challenge today in the battle of the sexes, is that when we say equal, we really mean the same. And let's face it, men and women are not the same. And trust me, when it comes to communication, we communicate very, very differently. And this deck will look at the difference between the way men and women communicate. And the reason it's important to know this is because sometimes you're going to work with men, sometimes you're going to work with women, sometimes you're going to work for a man or a woman, and sometimes your customers are going to be men and women. So the more you can understand the unique differences in the way each of the various sexes communicate or genders communicate, the better off you're going to be in the long run. Research shows that men and women have different styles, and the first difference, according to research, is that women like to communicate to build a consensus, and men communicate to figure out where they are in the hierarchy. Now, these are generalized statements. So this does not mean that all men and women fall into these categories. Men communicate to achieve social status and, more importantly, to avoid failure. And this is a critical difference between men and women. Avoiding failure and what you're going to see on the next slide regarding women are not the same things. They sound similar, but they're not the same things. Women communicate, on the other hand, to achieve personal connection, some type of a personal connection with that person, and to avoid social isolation. And you can look up the full article or some of the full research at the link I've posted below. Book that says men are from Mars and women are from Venus, Venus being the hotter planet and Mars being the cooler planet. And if you look at communication, that would certainly have some validity. Women communicate specifically to develop a rapport, and that's because they plan to use those social connections later on. Men, on the other hand, communicate to determine rapport. And the reason they do that is because they aren't necessarily going to use those relationships, but they want to know where they stand in relationship to everybody else. The next major difference that we see in relationship to men and women is that men internalize their issues. They take them in. They don't necessarily talk about their feelings. They don't necessarily talk about the facts of a particular issue. Instead, they bring it in, they think about it, and then they discuss it. Women, on the other hand, use the method of discussion to talk about their problems, to get that information out there. So it's a very different style. And I saw this up close and personal in a company I worked for. In one of the companies that I worked for, it was myself and two men at the helm. And the company president asked me what I thought about a particular program. It was the first time I had seen the program or even looked at it, and it was in reference to my sales staff. And I said, well, let me ask you some questions. And I asked a ton of questions. And the other guy, who was my equal, never asked one single question. Instead, he just sat there. And then at the end, he said, I like it. Never asked a question. So my boss said to me, why can't you be more like him? Why can't you just accept things? I said, well, you asked me my opinion. But he really didn't want my opinion. He wanted me to do what the gentleman did. He wanted me to take that information in, internalize it, and then give, a quick, I agree with it or I don't agree with it. I didn't do that. I'm a typical woman, and instead I discussed it at length. And he didn't appreciate that. So sometimes, as a woman, you have to be smart, and you have to see when somebody appreciates that quick discussion and when somebody wants more of a conversation. And the purpose to relationships is different between men and women. Again, research shows that men build their relationships to complete tasks. They're task oriented, whereas women build relationships to get things done through connections. And part of this could just be that women have had to do this through history because this is the way, we weren't allowed necessarily early on to be as aggressive as we are today. And for men, it was a completely different situation. So some of the gender stereotypes that we've experienced in the past may have actually driven us to have a slightly different purpose in the reasons we communicate. We certainly argue differently as well. I mean, women can have a disagreement with a fellow female, and it completely impacts all aspects of our relationship. It makes it difficult to do business with somebody that you've had a huge disagreement with. Men, on the other hand, can disagree, finish the task, and then move on. They don't have to necessarily like each other or have a strong emotional feeling about each other in order to complete something, which can be very beneficial. My husband was a hockey player, and I actually watched him and a group of his friends have a fist fight in the parking lot at the ice rink and then go out and have coffee together. That just would not happen for women. Women would not go out with each other after that and have coffee. And if they did, they would be giving each other the face. So there is a difference in the way we argue, and you need to understand that difference so you can appreciate it when you're working with people from different genders. Even something as simple as nonverbal can be very confusing. So women will nod during a presentation to show, I'm listening to you, I hear what you're saying, but men nod when they're in agreement with you. So you can be in a presentation and you've got a woman who's in the audience nodding, indicating she's paying attention, she's listening. And then at the end, the man can say, well, you were in agreement. And she'll say, no, I wasn't. I don't know what made you think I was in agreement. And that's a simple miscommunication. And it begins just because we make assumptions about the opposite gender based on how we respond. We think it's okay to ask questions because that's how we would handle it. We think it's okay to get in a fist fight and go out for a cup of coffee because, well, that's how you handle it. So you have to be cognizant of the other side, and you have to be cognizant of the fact that there are differences. There are ways that we communicate a result of our gender, sometimes a result of our age, our upbringing, our culture, that aren't going to change overnight. So the more you can understand, just as you do with different cultures, the more you can understand the differences in the genders, forms of communication, the better off you are. Even in the mechanics of communication, we're different. In the course of the day, women use a lot more words than men. And I don't mean a small amount, I mean thousands more words per day. And we express more feelings more willingly. Men, on the other hand, use less words and they express less feelings. They express more about the situation, whereas women express the emotion of the situation. Even when it comes to word choice, women and men are completely different. Women use more what we call permission words. I've posted an article by a former Google executive, a female executive, who indicates the permission words are the death of women. You should read it, whether you're a man or a woman, because you're going to have women that work for you, or you might have a sister or girlfriend, and it's not a bad article to read. Permission words are qualifiers like just, wish. When you say, I just need a minute of your time, I wish we could get this done, that is not the way men speak. Men will say, I need a minute of your time. There's no permission asked in there. And so this Google executive indicates that we need to be aware of permission words and we need to stop using them. Why should we even care about this topic? Well, number one, in business, you're going to work for or with the opposite gender. There is no doubt in my mind. I have worked for women. I have worked for men. I have had women as my peers and men as my peers. I have had women as my employees and I have had men as my employees and I have had women and men as my customers at all of those levels. And it makes sense that you need to understand how the opposite gender approaches things so that you can be more aware of how to address it properly with them. And it doesn't hurt you in your family situation or in your personal relationships either. The more you can understand the opposite gender, the more you're willing to accept the differences between you and the opposite gender. You know, I used to get very frustrated with my husband because he didn't express his feelings very well. But as I've gotten to be more aware of the differences in communication styles, I understand that that's just his style. I can get him to do it periodically, but I just need to I need to calm down about that and realize he's just different than the way I am. So research shows that the higher a woman goes in business ranks, the more likely her speech pattern is to change and become more like a man's. Now, this could be because you're more surrounded by more men, but regardless what the reasoning is, the longer you spend in a male-dominated industry, a male-dominated role, and the higher you go in the executive ranks, the more you sound like a man.